Welcome back to the Metric Stack podcast. Today's guest is James Neufeld. He's the founder and CEO of Samdesk, a global disruption monitoring tool powered by big data and AI. Today, we'll chat with James about how he's gone back to first principles to move the needle on key metrics, experimenting with incremental actions, and then looking in the rearview mirror to see their impact. I'm Lauren Thibodeau, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alan Villa. Huge welcome to the show, James.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Hey, James. So before we get started and into the weeds too much, why don't we set the stage a little bit? So you've done your Series A and big congrats on that a little bit. Tell us a little bit how metrics became a shared language of communication specifically between you and your new board of directors.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I mean, it's one of the only, common languages that investors have, right? They evaluate so many different opportunities and so many different novel concepts, and they're typically never kind of the domain experts too much in their space, right? So you have to create a shared language on understanding the opportunity. And so financial metrics, user metrics, adoption metrics, a lot of different kind of buckets that they'll look at for metrics, become obviously really, really important to understand the opportunity. And we actually found it like a really cathartic process. And we worked with a lot of great partners to kind of understand our own metrics and work with investors and really understanding why they had certain metrics that were really important to them, across everything from, just kind of general, the suspected metrics like annual recurring revenue, your ARR, churn rate, and kind of the obvious ones, but also just, net dollar retention, NDR, really important new metrics that just help quantify the business in ways that we didn't even understand ourselves. And it really, shone the spotlight at some strengths and weaknesses in the business. So that became really important. And working with Mark Rock, they led our Series A, which we're so delighted to work with. Diversity and inclusion was one of the metrics that they looked at as well. So we actually did DEI surveys to actually understand, the culture of the company that we were building. And so, so metrics is a broad term. Obviously, everybody at Klipfolio is going to know that very, very well. And so, so that, it really forced us to think about, metrics, a lot more than we had historically as a company. And it was a great process to, find that shared language between ourselves and our investors and just coming to the table being like, I think this is good. Is this good? Is this bad? What does this mean for our business? And is a Series A, it's different for different stages, obviously, but it was really that opportunity for us to have a very good dialogue with investors and amongst ourselves to understand where we were as a company.
Yeah, that's really helpful context. Thanks, James. And when you were kind of establishing that shared language, did you find that the metrics were both leading and lagging, or did you find they were more lagging indicators? It's kind of an assumption on my part that might have been a challenge, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in retrospect, I think that's one of the challenges that maybe, we didn't have a good understanding of leading and lagging at the time. I think it's just a full, colonoscopy of the business, right? They're just trying to understand and get, all the details in the data and data room and all that sort of stuff that they're trying to comb through the fine tooth comb, right? And so I think in retrospect, and we've had a lot of good board meetings and conversations about that since, is identifying a metric in a kind of a point in time analysis. It's one of the things that's really forgotten, right? Is this a leading or is this a lagging indicator? Because you can look at a point in time number and say, oh, that's really good. Like, revenue's up 100%. That's really good. And what you might not realize when you're having that discussion with your investors is that that's actually a lagging indicator of a whole bunch of other things that you may not have as good of a grasp on as you probably should, right? And it's one of the things that we struggled with, and I see a lot of, Series A's companies struggles with that as well, is you hit a growth spurt. And that's great. That's a really good indicator. It absolutely is. But if you don't understand what's driving the growth, it can be really deceptive, right? Because that growth could stop all of a sudden, for example, or it can get really challenged in an economic headwind that we're seeing in a lot of the tech sector. And it will really rock you to your core because you had a great metric that you put in front of your investors, and maybe you didn't actually realize that was much more of a lagging indicator, and you didn't really understand the leading components of it. So I would think that, during our Series A process, and I can speak just from the Samdesk perspective, right? Great discussion on metrics that pointed to a whole bunch of things that are really interesting and important for us. We perhaps didn't fully understand, what was driving what at each phase, as we kind of went through that process.
So, I mean, this is really interesting because it sounds like you've really gone through quite the process, both educating yourself and also, fine-tuning the process and how you're getting data, understanding which ones are inputs, which ones are outputs. What was it like? And I've got to ask, like, what was it like before you started working with these investors, had this board? What was it like at Samdesk before the Series A?
Yeah, I think, before, raising a Series A, and it's part of our journey coming around back to first principles a little bit, but I think it's, generally, very, very first principles driven, right? Like, are we doing right by the customer? Are we delivering the feature that we said we would? Are we reacting fast enough to feedback? What is our customer response times? What is, a lot of just very tangible, if it takes you a very long time to get back to somebody, that's not a great customer experience, right? And so we tended to think about a lot of things in that regard, right? Like, what makes just common, obvious sense that you would want to experience as a customer yourself, and just apply that to the business in other areas. And so, the challenge with that, though, right, is that it's not apparently, not very apparently documented. It's not very clearly outlined that when you start to scale your team, that you can just hand somebody a playbook, right? It's much harder to say, although very true, but it's harder to say, just make sure the customer feels heard and you respond quickly. That's a harder thing to train around, and that's a harder thing to expect, new team members as rapidly scaling and growing. That's very widely open to interpretation, right? And so you hit these things again, you're like, oh yeah, okay. It's not wrong, but it's not enough, and it's not clearly defined enough to repeat, right? So it was the before and after, Alan, I think, is like a lot of that, right? Like, before Series A lot of things are going well. We had, doubled the company in terms of team and revenue several years in a row, but it was off of the back of a lot of first principles and not a lot of scalable, methodologies. And so,
Yeah, so James, that resonates with me. I actually quite like that. I mean, I hear from a lot of, especially founding members, that, the DNA, the things that they believe in, their values are really what drives behaviors. So, when you say, yeah, we want to make sure that you respond to customers in a timely manner so that they feel heard and respected. Okay, that's great. And phase two, as you start scaling and hiring employees, is okay, how are we going to measure that, right? So I actually think this idea of first principles leads beautifully into, okay, now we're maturing, we've got an external board. And as you said, how do we communicate with that? Okay, well, we got to put a number around it, right? So I know that recently you have taken another first principles approach at your metrics. So maybe dovetail that thinking of yours into how you're approaching or recasting some of your metrics today.
I think it's easy to over rotate, right? So you go, from a very first principles only kind of thing that we were discussing, Alan. You raise around and you spend months doing that, right? It's not just a 1 week process that you're raising money, right? It's a very long process, right? It can, took us about 6 months to close around. And so it's 2 whole quarters where you're starting to change your methodology and thinking at a company as you go about it as well, right? You're like, okay, so this is really important. Let's put a number behind it. This number is really good, so keep doing that. This number or metric is not good, so don't do, figure that one out. And I think, in a bit of a retrospect for us too, it's not, anti-metrics. It's just, again, for us, we really didn't understand what was an input and output, as you said, right? We didn't understand the leading or lagging. So you jump, both feet into identifying what you think are potential problem areas of the company because, a metric told you that a deal stuck in pipeline for too long, go fix that, right? And so you have this transition period where, you think you're finding a whole bunch of things, and what you might be doing and what we were doing, I think, in some regards, right, is we put metrics in front of, first principles in terms of a results, right? And so you just speak a number, and, that becomes, marching orders for a team that go executing on changing that one number. And so I think, what we've been trying to do is just, kind of, make sure that we're not forgetting first principles and kind of, a path towards, clearly documenting clear metrics. And so for us, what we talk about a lot of times here now too already, like really pushing the team to understand what kind of input will get the metric that you think is important. But the emphasis there is we've been, really introducing more first principles. It's having a really deep conversation, an honest conversation with yourself, your board, and your team, and saying, sales are maybe not where they want to be. There's a common theme I'm sure most companies are going to go through. What are the actions that you're doing that you expect are going to drive a particular result, right? We know what the results are. We can tell the metric. We can see our annual growth rate. There's great tools out there that will help you measure these things. But where people spend less time, I find, and even you hire, different members and teams and different corporate cultures get, brought into your company, there's not that deep radical candor conversation around like maybe what we should be tracking is the number of flights that we book, per month. If we're not booking flights, we're not in front of our customers, but that's not a metric that we had identified. It didn't seem, inherently important to us, right?
Yeah.
You tend to act on superficial metrics based on the Series A process, which are not bad, but again, they could be very much downstream of things that we did 6 months ago that we weren't even measuring, right? It's like
Yeah.
we weren't measuring time on flight and time in front of customers as like an important metric that would fundamentally change our pipeline for the industry that we're serving. We just looked at a lot of ARR. So that was part of the process, I think, for us, Alan, of like, how do we think about, from first principles to like a deep dive on metrics of like, let's really understand this business of going through an investor round to like, oh, hang on, do we really understand what our inputs and outputs are? And when we talk about measuring what matters, it's like, well, now if the sales team, for example, is down on, customer FaceTime, you can begin to predict that that's going to have an impact on pipeline because we're just not in front of the customers in the same way.
Yeah.
But it's surprising how many little examples like that go unspoken, at least for us, around like, hey, we'll back up like 7 or 8 layers deeper here, guys.
Yeah.
What is the real downstream or upstream thing that you do every day really well that will have a downstream impact on the number that I really care about?
Yeah, so awesome insights there. And I think of Steve Jobs' quote, right? You can only connect the dots looking backwards. You can't really connect them looking forwards, right? And so you're talking about going back, multiple levels to get to that ARR, what's going to influence that. Can you kind of break that down a little bit more for us? Like, what are some of the other things? So there's time on flights. What are you looking at now when you take that kind of innovator's approach back to first principles?
Yeah, another one that we've been talking a lot about internally at Samdesk too, when it comes to, product innovation, we know that, speed to delivering new features is really important for us. We are challenging a new challenger in an existing space. And so there's a lot of hesitancy that comes with that. And so we need to combat that with, rapid iteration on, how fast we can ship features based on customer feedback. So that's really hard to measure, right? Like there's so much there to even unpack to think like, okay, how do I measure that? And what we've deduced is, one of the things that the team is really struggling with is, moving fast, being perfected, making sure we delight customers. And so they hear a lot of these words coming from, perhaps leadership or my mouth and thinking, how do I measure that? And what we found out by pulling back the layers on that in particular, Lauren, is right. Like, well, what we're really trying to do is, hurry up the whole innovation cycle. So the faster we get a complaint, the faster we can act on it. And the longer that we delay getting customer complaints, the longer we delay the innovation cycle. And so we've really embraced other things. It's not just time on planes and getting in front of customers in terms of first principle measurements. It's like we say, speed to customer complaint. The faster we can get a complaint on the new feature, the faster that's going to really help us respond to it, because for better or worse, the company, we tend to, we respond very quickly to complaints. That helps hit the DNA of the company. We don't want to let people down. So we don't try to disappoint customers, but we know that if we're not getting those complaints and we're not getting it fast enough, that tells us as we've taken too long probably to ship the feature. It was stuck into production for too long. And so we can control, of course, like the group. We don't have to send it to like general pop. We don't have to give it to all of our customers. But like I'm pushing the team to be like, if we're not getting that, that tells me we took too long and we're gonna fail on the ultimate objective here, because the speed to complaint is a really important metric, even though that's not what we're trying to achieve from an NPS perspective and customer success perspective. It's a really important, product innovation cycle.
Time to customer complaint, TCC. I love it. So I've heard of other similar metrics. Like I remember our sales team had a metric that they were tracking, which was conversation rate. Right. So how often are you actually not just emailing, but actually having a live conversation with a prospect, right, or an account, right? And I think those kind of things, they're important, right? These are the things that you need to be reminded of. So let's look at the flip side. I mean, it sounds like you're drinking the Kool-Aid. The board, they're looking at metrics. You guys are looking at metrics. You're going a few levels deep. One of the things that always inevitably happens is you start having this massive list of metrics and KPIs. What are the ones that you have just not looked at in like a year? And absolutely mean nothing to you anymore, right? Like what did you at some point say, we got to measure this, and it turned out to really not make a lick of difference?
Yeah. It's like I want to add as many metrics as I possibly can into that bucket just to like give myself some defense. Yeah, I think it's like I think ARR, at least at the stage of where we are, is one of those, to be very honest. It's maybe a common one that people talk about and put it in that bucket, but purely just for the fact that it is the most important North Star for a SaaS business. And I will, openly say that, and we have that shared agreement with our board. It's also just the one that's most distracting for me and the team.
It's also, I mean, for sure. And it's the one that is the furthest away from, what everybody's actually doing tactically to get there right now. I agree. It's got to be part of it, but you don't have to look at it every day.
Yeah, and it's like, and it's the question that everybody asks immediately up front. It's like, "Hi, how are you? What's your ARR?" So it's like part of that vernacular of like that's kind of how we measure success. That's how we look at things and that sort of stuff, right? And so it's tough. I would, so one of those things where I think that are the most interesting to me are probably ARR and churn, because they're the most important things to any SaaS business, and they're just the two things that are the most lagging indicators of anything you're doing. And when you're at this size and the amount of things you get done in a week is has to be really, really high. That's the whole point of a challenger and a startup, to move as fast as possible. And so those metrics are just so unaligned with what your day-to-day activities are from most intents and purposes, that they end up being the most problematic metrics that I think we obsess about a lot.
I mean, churn is just such a depressing metric, right? I mean, the first, you wake up on Monday morning. What do you do first? You look at churn. Oh, the whole week is ruined.
The whole week is ruined. And it's like this thing of like, spend your time and energy on the things that you can influence, like spend time and energy where you can make a difference, right? And so the first principles part that we're, really trying to, work on and continually just, keep at the forefront for us of the journey here at Samdesk, right? I mean, like we're talking about churn, like it's like, this big number, obviously, it's your company will die if you're not paying attention to it. But, so many things have happened between now and the churn decision point, right? And like, what are you analyzing there? How do you move the needle on that, right? How do you not get surprised by that? How do you, go beyond, NPS and just, superficial measurement things at certain times? That's like, what are the number of conversations? How many complaints have they actually have? What is the resolution time on complaints? What are the things that you can kind of, look back and easily tack onto your day-to-day, and don't let metrics form your process as much as take a common sense approach to your process. What do you think is the right thing to do in this situation? How would you like to resolve it? Okay, go do that first of all. And then if it makes sense for the next customer, do it again. And by the third time, now you have some semblance of a process, probably some idea of how you can measure that. And that's how, process and measurement, probably should get formed. Yet again, what we do, and we still fall victim to this at Samdesk all the time, right? It's like, oh, churn is really, really, oh, let's talk about that, right? I'm like, oh, I don't know, like it is what it is, and we have a problem here, or we don't have a problem, whatever. Let's talk about the things that led to it, because those are hard conversations. Nobody wants to have them, and they're very difficult. So the team avoids them. I avoid them, right? You're like, I don't know what led to this. If I would have known, I would have done something about it, right? And so, but it really brings up this internal conversation that you should be having, right? Like, do what makes sense now, do it again. If it's totally different the second time, you got it wrong the first time, that's fine. But if you can repeat it 3 times, you probably have some form of a process now, but it was driven from, organic, proper behavior, not a, numbers down approach of saying, this is the number, go do that, right?
Yeah.
And so, goes back to me what you're saying, Lauren, right, on Steve Jobs. Like you can connect the dots after the fact, but it's really hard in the moment. Yet I see, myself, my team, a lot of other companies, like let's talk about metrics and let's talk about how to influence them. And that's dangerous sometimes, right?
Yeah. Has anything surprised you either on the positive side or the, damn, we're going back to first principles and that didn't quite work the way I expected? Has anything surprised you on either side of that equation from your kind of refocused approach?
I mean, I think that's why we have been refocusing, right? I think the surprise for us, Lauren, I think was naming metrics and being focused on metrics didn't lead to better metrics. So that was kind of like a surprise, being like, oh, I thought like naming it and measuring it was the key here, right? And it's not that it's not, but it's that distinguishing, understanding the importance of the order of operations that's sometimes forgotten, right?
Okay.
And so That's probably the surprise for us, right?
Yeah, and you often hear people saying you get what you measure. Well, you can't just measure it and get it. You've got to go back and do all these other things too. Okay.
Things are just changing. So I don't know where you guys are at, where you're seeing this, and you guys are really close to this, right? But like I feel like things are just changing so fast these days. COVID expedited so many business procedures and like playbooks, and like the BDR function just disappeared. Like it stopped working for so many companies so quickly. Marketing tactics changed, customer success tactics changed. And it just feels to me that like all that sort of stuff has been changing so fast. And there's a real trap, I think, for a lot of entrepreneurs now, that a lot of advice that was very sound and good even a short while ago is changing. And a lot of that advice is based on some sort of agreed upon metric, right? So like, this is the important metric you should track, and here's what you should do to go about that. And what's important is that you find your process of how to influence your metrics. And that's the key, right? But we're all reading the blog post. We want to understand faster. So it's good, but things are changing fast.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there was COVID, there was the, interest rates and focus on profitability. There's AI. Those are three big things that have changed a lot of business strategy. And so you have to adapt, right? And you've got to have that flexibility. So just blindly measuring won't get you there. So I think you're absolutely right. You have to unpeel those layers and really figure out like what is actually driving these outcomes that we want at the business, and then start measuring those things, because that's how you're going to actually influence that, ultra important ARR metric.
Totally. And those are the conversations that are hard to have, right? But they are, the conversations to have, they're the important ones. And what I like about that is, the process that you get to have with your team about just peeling back the layers, week after week. Is that, did that go as expected? Why are you doing that? Does that even make sense, right? Like just pause the top line, churn and ARR, NPS stuff that we'll see in 6 months' time if what we're doing today was effective, right?
So let's bring it back to the board. So you're recasting, you're relooking at first principles, you're examining what metrics actually, are measurable and influence, other metrics. Is that what is next for your executive team and your board, is to sort of come up with this new level of, this is what we're going to measure because it actually matters?
Yeah, I think it's a continual, and we're very lucky to have a supportive board in that regard. So very thankful there. And it's a continual pursuit of learning that's really important, right? Like, how can we speed up the innovation cycle? How can we speed up the learning cycle? And it's one thing, you get upside of the spectrum advice, right? Like you get like, if you can't measure it, you can't, you can't make progress. There's also, the other side of it maybe, which is like, fail fast. Like the faster you fail, the better, blah, blah, blah. But like, we don't put metrics on failure, right? So we're like, we don't agree upon how to measure those types of things. Sometimes we just measure the top line good stuff, and we don't always measure the bad stuff and kind of measure the things that will, be ultimately important for us. And so yeah, I think with the board, Alan, and I think the board, the wider kind of, group behind Samdesk, right? It's, how have we taken down key logos that we think are influential for our sector? How have we responded to certain types of feedback given these kind of market conditions? So it does become somewhat narrative driven, but you have to quantify that as well. And so, are the things that we're seeing in the trends that we're learning, are those isolated incidents, or are those part of a bigger trend? So we're spending a lot of time trying to be very methodical and clearly understanding the difference. And I think that's been hard for any company that we've been talking about. These days we talk about those changes within AI and regulation and wars and all this sort of stuff that have an impact on company purchasing behaviors, right? And so that's where we spend a lot of time today, Alan, I think is trying to bring both parts of the conversation, right? So every conversation that we always have, we do bring up churn and ARR. Every single conversation with the board, investors, it is what it is, right? The point is to not sugarcoat anything. And I think that's perhaps an important distinction to make in this conversation. I see entrepreneurs that might talk about first principles, and it becomes a very easy way to get out of hard conversations as well. And being like, oh, successful entrepreneurs talk about metrics and like unsuccessful ones tell great stories. So you have to be very careful and like understanding the difference, right? So I think that that's been a very acknowledged part, at least with our board and our investors and the dynamic at Samdesk. But at the same time, if you look at metrics into themselves, you're not going to drive the needle. If you're looking at stories into themselves without trying to measure them or put any quantification on there, you're just telling stories and you're never going to be able to repeat that process. So it's it goes back to, I think in my mind, Alan, the story of like the transition from Samdesk of like pre-Series A, Series A, and like, how do we not forget first principles in there? You have to take both in consideration at all times, right? How do you read the tea leaves very, very closely? I tend to like hyper obsess about almost every customer interaction. I don't think they happen in isolation. I don't think comments are just said willy-nilly. People think about things, they communicate things in a very particular way, and those are important indicators for the business. Are they struggling with the feature set? Is a competitor coming out with something new that we need to be very closely paying attention to? The shifting winds these days can change very, very fast. Big companies, topple faster than we think that they normally would have, right? We've seen big changes in the tech space in particular, right? So that to me says that we need to be having a lot of conversations in front of our customers all the time. Myself, the team, the leadership, we bring those stories to our board meeting. We hear direct customer feedback on our board meeting every single time in their own words to hear directly from what our customers are saying. So when we talk about ARR, we always pair that, or churn for that matter, we pair that with actual, comments from our customers to hear both sides of it. So I think our view is that you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, that's a powerful combination, that qualitative and quantitative together. So as we wrap up here, James, like fascinating journey. Thank you for sharing it with us. Any last words of advice if it's resonated with listeners and they want to go back to first principles? Closing word of advice.
Just get on with it. I don't know. just what I'm trying to tell myself these days too. The analysis paralysis is real. The numbers are super important. Look at them. Look at new metrics you haven't considered before. Analyze, dissect, understand. Don't get paralyzed by it. That is not a substitute for talking to your customers. You have to do both.
James, thank you so much. Everybody, James Neufeld, founder and CEO of Samdesk. This has been really, really good. There was so much really contextually rich content here that often gets ignored when you're looking at only the numbers. So everybody's got to remind themselves, first principles, let's go back to really understanding what's important. How do you measure the needle? Not by just measuring the end result, but what are the things that actually lead there? So again, James, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks so much for having me.
If you enjoyed today's conversation about metrics and data, be sure to check out Metric HQ, our online resource for the metrics that matter most to you and your business.